The frost came early to Aldcroft that November, settling into the gaps between the stable cobblestones before the sky had fully decided on morning. Vivian Aldcroft stood at the yard's edge with a lantern held at her side, her breath visible in the cold air, watching Nathaniel Voss work. He moved through the pre-dawn routine with the particular sureness of a man who had made his peace with early hours and physical labor, checking the near foreleg on the gray, running a hand along the animal's flank, speaking something low that she could not hear, but that the horse clearly could. She had stood in this exact position, watching him from this exact distance, more mornings than she could honestly count. She had never before had a folded paper in her coat pocket that would change everything he believed about himself. She pulled it out now, and the sound of the paper unfolding carried across the yard. He turned. "Nathaniel," she said. He crossed to her without hurry, because Nathaniel never hurried. He moved with the particular economy of a man who had learned that urgency rarely improved a situation. He took the lantern from her hand without asking, held it up to read, and she watched his face in the yellow light as he read the special marriage license with both their names printed on it in the curate's careful hand. He read it through once. Then he read it again. Then he looked up. "How long have you known?" he asked. The way he asked it, not "What is this?" not "Why?" but "How long have you known?" told her in the space of 4 words that she had underestimated him. She'd suspected he might be surprised. She had not considered that he might not be. "I will explain everything," Vivian said. "Every piece of it. I promise you that. But I am asking you to trust me for one morning first, and then I will answer every question you have for as long as you want to ask them." He was quiet for a moment. The gray shifted behind him, and he put a hand back without looking to settle the animal. "One morning," he said. "That is all I am asking." He looked at her steadily. She had learned, over 3 years of early mornings in this yard, that when Nathaniel went still, it was not because he had stopped thinking. It was because he was thinking more carefully than usual. The lantern light moved slightly in the cold air between them. "All right," he said. They were married before noon. The curate performed the ceremony in the small vestry off the Aldcroft chapel, with Vivian's maid Dorcas as one witness and the curate's own wife pressed into service as the second. The license was in order. The ceremony was brief and correct. When the curate asked if either party had cause to object, the vestry was entirely silent, except for the sound of the wind against the stone walls. Nathaniel said his vows in the same voice he used for everything, plain and deliberate, without performance. Vivian said hers and found, to her own mild surprise, that her voice did not shake. When it was done, Nathaniel took her hand and held it for a moment with his thumb pressed once against her palm, and then let go. Dorcas wept quietly on the walk back to the house. Neither Vivian nor Nathaniel spoke very much. There was, Vivian thought, a great deal to say, and she was still assembling the order of it. She would not have long. By the time the light began to fail that afternoon, Lord Prentice Alcourt had already sent word to the 2 other men whose proposals Vivian had refused in the preceding 18 months. She had refused 3 men in total. Alcourt himself, the Duke of Marin, who held her late father's debt, and a 3rd gentleman named Farquhar, who had the misfortune of being perfectly acceptable and entirely beside the point. Each refusal had been delivered with impeccable courtesy, and no explanation that satisfied anyone. The county had drawn its own conclusions, which were unflattering. Now, with the news of the morning's marriage spreading through the household staff and from there outward with the speed that small counties always managed, the 3 men gathered at Alcourt's house at Fenwick Cross before dusk. What passed between them in that room was not witnessed, but its results were entirely visible. Each man had his account. Alcourt had been refused 8 months ago. His proposal met with a quiet regret that gave him nothing to argue with, and no foothold for appeal. Maren, whose claim on the Aldcroft estate through the Baron's unpaid debts made his proposal less a romantic gesture than a financial maneuver, had been refused 6 months before that. Farquhar, genuinely puzzled, had his own version of a polite and inexplicable no. 3 men, 3 refusals, one morning's news of a marriage to a groom's son. The arithmetic was not complicated. By the time the fire in Alcourt's sitting room had burned down to coals, the broad shape of a legal petition had been agreed upon, and Alcourt's solicitor was already being sent for. The petition arrived at Aldcroft 5 days later, carried by a messenger who handed it to Vivian's steward with the particular expressionlessness of a man paid to deliver bad news without opinions. It named Vivian as a woman of compromised judgment, insufficient to give valid consent to marriage. It named Nathaniel as a person of fraudulent claim, exercising undue influence over a vulnerable woman of property. It requested annulment on both grounds, and it was signed by Alcourt's solicitor with a thoroughness that suggested considerable time had been spent on it. Nathaniel found her in the library. She was sitting in the chair nearest the fire, very still, with the document open in her lap and her hands resting on either side of it. She was not reading it. She had already read it. She was simply sitting with it in the way that a person sits with something that has weight. He crossed the room and knelt before her chair and took both her hands in his, lifting them away from the document so that it slid to the floor. His hands were warm, she noticed, warmer than hers, which had gone cold somewhere between reading the petition and hearing his footstep in the doorway. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did she. The fire worked steadily in the grate, and the room darkened around them as the evening came on. And they remained there until the fire had burned itself down to almost nothing. And the cold of the room finally brought them both back to the practical question of what they were going to do next. What they were going to do next required money, which was in short supply, and a solicitor, which required money. Vivian spent one night with the household accounts and her grandmother's settlement papers, and by the following morning she had identified the last available funds, a portion of a legacy held in trust since her grandmother's death, accessible to Vivian as sole heir and never previously touched because she had hoped not to need it. She had touched it now. She sent a letter to a Lincoln's Inn solicitor named Hartwell, whose name she had from her father's papers and whose reputation for documentary work was, by all accounts, sound. Hartwell arrived 3 days later, a compact man in his middle 50s with the particular quality of attention that very good solicitors develop. He listened to everything before he spoke. And when he spoke, he said exactly what he meant. Vivian and Nathaniel spent 3 days laying their combined documents before him on the library table. The special license, the marriage certificate, the birth record, the letter from Nathaniel's mother that Vivian had kept in a locked drawer for 3 years, and the documents the dying woman had carried in a leather folio that was now worn at the corners from handling. Hartwell read everything. He read it in the order they gave it to him, and then he rearranged it in a different order and read it again. On the evening of the second day, he set his spectacles on the table and looked at them both. "Your position is defensible," he said. "The petition rests on 2 claims, compromised judgment and fraudulent identity. The first is difficult to prove against a woman who has managed an estate alone for 2 years and engaged a solicitor using her own funds. The second depends entirely on whether the identity claim can be documented to the satisfaction of the court. For that, I need the ecclesiastical record confirmed by a Church of England archivist. The Lincoln Diocese Registry should hold the original entry. If the annulment was filed when I believe it was filed, it is void on its face." "Why void?" Nathaniel asked. "Because an annulment filed after the death of one party has no legal standing," Hartwell said. "The marriage was contracted in 1789, If the Earl died before the annulment was entered into the registry, the entry is a nullity. The marriage stands, which means the legitimate heir stands with it. He looked at Nathaniel with the careful neutrality of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what the aristocracy got up to. I will write to Lincoln tomorrow. The social consequences began before Hartwell's letter had reached Lincoln. Mrs. Dowell, whose family farmed the eastern boundary of the Aldcroft estate, and who had called on Vivienne every season for 4 years, sent a note declining the standing invitation to Sunday dinner. It was brief and apologetic, and said nothing directly, which was its own form of directness. 2 days later, the Hargreaves family, whose daughter had been Vivienne's particular companion since childhood, sent a similar note. The vicar, encountering Vivienne on the lane outside the church, managed a greeting of such careful hedging that she was 3 steps past him before she realized he had said nothing substantive at all. Then Alcourt's letter arrived. Nathaniel brought it in from the village himself. He set it on the library table without comment and stood back while Vivienne read it. It was addressed, she noted, not to her, but to the neighboring households of the county, and it had been circulating for at least 2 days before a copy reached her. It suggested, in language of careful indirection, that Miss Aldcroft, Alcourt pointedly did not use her married name, had been subject to undue influence from a member of her own household staff, and that her recent actions reflected a judgment compromised by isolation and grief following her father's death. It stopped short of any specific accusation that could be answered in court. It did not need to go further. The insinuation was sufficient. Vivienne set the letter down. "Alcourt's copy," she said, half to herself. "What copy?" Nathaniel asked. She went still in the particular way she went still when she realized she had said something she had not yet explained. She looked up at him, and he was watching her with the patient attention that she had come to understand. Meant he was waiting for something he suspected he already partly knew. "There is something I have not told you," she said. "About what Alcourt holds." "Tell me now," Nathaniel said. I will tell you everything. But not piece by piece, Nathaniel. All of it, properly, so you have the full picture. Give me until this evening." He considered this. "This evening," he said. Alcourt arrived at Aldcroft 2 mornings later without sending word ahead. He came to the stable yard, which was deliberate, not to the front door, not to the library where Vivienne received callers, but to the yard where Nathaniel worked, in the hour when Nathaniel would be most visibly himself. A man in working clothes, with hay on his coat and the smell of horses on his hands. Alcourt was dressed for riding, with 2 of his own men positioned at the yard's gate, and he addressed Nathaniel directly in a voice pitched to carry. "I will speak plainly," Alcourt said. "Whatever arrangement you have made with Miss Aldcroft, it will not survive the hearing. A man with no documented history, no name that any county record confirms, and no claim that has been tested in any court. That man does not become an earl because a lonely woman decided to believe a story. The petition will be heard, the marriage will be set aside, and whatever she has promised you will dissolve with it." Nathaniel did not respond immediately. He set down the bridle he had been working on, straightened, and turned to face Alcourt with the particular stillness that Vivienne had learned to read. He did not look like a man who had been insulted. He looked like a man who had received information he already had. Vivienne had come into the yard from the side entrance. She crossed the cobblestones and stepped to stand directly at Nathaniel's side. Her shoulder against his arm, her body turned to face Alcourt, and she held that position without speaking. She did not reach for Nathaniel's hand. She did not look at him. She simply stood beside him in the cold morning air and looked at Alcourt with the composed attention she had learned from her father, who had told her once that the most unsettling thing a person could do in a hostile situation was to refuse to be unsettled. Alcourt looked at her. He looked at the two of them together. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite uncertainty, but the precursor to it. He turned and left without speaking again. His two men followed him through the gate. Nathaniel did not move for a moment after the sound of the horses faded. Then he said, very quietly, "Thank you." "You would have done the same," Vivienne said. "I would have," he agreed. "But you did it first." That evening in the library, she told him everything. She told him about the woman who had arrived at Aldcroft 3 years ago on a November evening, much like this one, thin and exhausted, and carrying a leather folio she would not set down, even when Vivienne's housekeeper tried to take it from her to help her to a chair. She told him how the woman had asked for her father by name, how Vivienne had had to tell her that her father had been dead for 4 months, and how the woman had received that news with a grief that was not fresh. It was the grief of someone who had been afraid of exactly this outcome for some time. She told him the woman's name was Catherine Harcastle, and that she had been the lawfully married wife of Edmund Harcastle, the 4th Earl of Westhorn, in a ceremony conducted in 1789 that the Earl had subsequently attempted to erase. She told him about the 6 weeks that followed, about the rooms she had prepared, about the conversations she had sat through as Catherine's strength declined, about the documents she had been given to keep. She told him about the burial in the small churchyard at the edge of the Aldcroft estate, and the decision she had made the following morning to give Catherine's son work in the stables as the only cover she could construct on short notice for a man who needed to be somewhere that was not his own estate. She told him why she had refused Alcourt. Not from eccentricity, not from grief, not from any of the reasons the county had assigned her. Because Alcourt's estate at Fenwick Cross shared a boundary with Westhorn, and she had learned, through the careful reading of her father's correspondence, which she had done thoroughly after his death, that Alcourt held a copy of the 1789 marriage certificate that he had obtained through means she did not yet fully understand, and that he had used it not as proof of legitimacy, but as leverage to secure a boundary agreement with the neighboring estate that the rightful Earl of Westhorn would never have signed. Marrying Alcourt would have put the certificate in his permanent possession and buried it with the marriage settlement. She had refused him. She had refused Marin because accepting his debt claim meant surrendering the estate where Nathaniel was hidden. She had refused Farquhar because accepting him meant leaving. She told him because she had promised herself she would not stop once she started, that she loved him, that she had not planned to, that it had arrived the way most things she had not planned arrived. Gradually, through the accumulation of mornings and honest conversation, and the particular quality of a man who asked nothing from anyone, and gave his full attention to whatever was in front of him, that she had told herself for some time it was irrelevant to the work, and that she had eventually stopped being able to maintain that position. When she finished, the fire had burned lower, and the room was quieter than it had been. Nathaniel had not interrupted her once. He had listened the way he listened to everything, with his full attention, without the restlessness that most people showed when they were waiting for their turn to speak. He picked up the leather folio from the table. He opened it, took out the certificate, and held it for a moment. Then he said, "I found the other one 6 months ago." Vivienne looked at him. "In my mother's effects," he said. She had kept a copy of the certificate separate from the folio. Sewn into the lining of her traveling case, I found it when I was going through what she had left. He set the document down carefully. "I have known my name for 6 months, Vivienne. I said nothing because I believed, I was fairly certain, that you had come to care for the man who worked in your stables. And I did not know whether the woman who cared for that man would be glad or sorry when he turned out to be someone else entirely. I was afraid the answer was sorry." The silence that followed had a different quality from the silences that had come before it. It was not the silence of people who had run out of things to say. It was the silence of people who had simultaneously realized the full shape of something. 3 years. She had been protecting his name before he knew what it was. 6 months. He had been carrying his name and saying nothing because he was trying to protect her from a loss he had imagined and she had never felt. They had been running operations of care in the same direction for 3 years, and neither of them had known the other one was doing it. Nathaniel reached across the table and took her hand. Not urgently, not dramatically. He simply picked up her hand and held it in both of his, and she felt the steadiness in him that she had been drawing on for 3 years without naming it. "No more concealment," he said. "From either side." "No," she agreed. "Then we face this together, with everything on the table." "Yes," she said. He leaned across the documents between them and kissed her once, slowly, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. When he drew back, he looked at her with an expression that was entirely new on his face. Not the careful steadiness she knew, but something open underneath it. "You are not alone in this," he said. "For the first time in 3 years, you are not alone in this." They returned to the documents. Alcourt's solicitor requested an early preliminary hearing before the full magistrate's date. He was confident. Vivian could see it in the man's posture when they arrived at the magistrate's anteroom. The particular ease of someone who believes he holds the decisive card. The room was small and cold, with 4 chairs on each side of a central table, and the magistrate's clerk making notes at a desk near the window. Alcourt sat with his solicitor and 2 supporting counsel, and he did not look at Vivienne or Nathaniel directly. Alcourt's solicitor rose and produced the document with a deliberateness that suggested he had been rehearsing the gesture. He laid the 1789 marriage certificate on the table and announced that here was proof of a fraudulent claim. A secret marriage contracted in scandal, subsequently annulled by the church, and now being used by a person of no legitimate standing to attach himself to a title and estate he had no legal right to approach. The magistrate examined the document. He looked at the date. He looked at the annulment notation in the margin. Hartwell rose. He produced the ecclesiastical record from Lincoln. He placed beside it a letter from the Church of England archivist confirming the date of the annulment filing. He laid both documents before the magistrate and said, in the unhurried tone of a man who had been looking forward to this moment, that the annulment notation in the margin of the certificate was entered into the Lincoln Diocese Registry on the 14th of March, 1803. The 4th Earl of Westhorn had died on the 2nd of March, 1803. The annulment had been filed 12 days after the death of one party to the marriage. Under ecclesiastical law and civil law alike, an annulment could not be applied retroactively to a deceased party. The entry was a legal nullity. The marriage of 1789 stood. Alcourt's solicitor understood what had happened approximately 1 breath after the magistrate did. Vivienne watched the realization move across his face. The particular expression of a man who has played a card and discovered it was his opponent's card all along. The hearing adjourned pending full review. The magistrate said nothing editorial. He did not need to. His expression as he gathered the documents said everything the room required. On the steps outside, the winter rain came down in straight, cold lines. Vivian stood at the top of the steps and felt the cold of it on her face and did not particularly mind. Nathaniel came to stand beside her, and without looking at her, he took her hand. "Not finished," he said. "Not finished," she agreed. "But possible." The assembly rooms at Chelworth were full on the evening of the winter gathering, as they always were. Candlelight and the smell of wood fires and damp wool. The particular noise of a county society that had known itself for generations and therefore had opinions about everything. Vivienne arrived with her chin level and her back straight, dressed in the dark blue wool she wore when she needed to feel like herself. Lady Fenwick saw her from across the room. Lady Fenwick turned her back. Every woman in her immediate circle turned with her. 5 women, then 3 more who caught the movement and understood it. Then several others at the room's edge who turned because the ones near them had turned. Vivienne stood in the center of the room and counted without meaning to. 30 pairs of eyes that had found reasons to look elsewhere. And the 10 seconds that followed were the longest she had experienced in recent memory. She walked to the refreshment table. She took a cup of tea. She found a chair near the wall, sat down, and drank the tea with the full attention of a woman who was choosing, with every sip, to remain exactly where she was. She stayed long enough that leaving would be her decision and not theirs. Then she left. Nathaniel was waiting with the carriage at the end of the lane. He had the door open before she reached him. She climbed in, and he closed the door and spoke to the driver. And the carriage moved off into the dark and the rain. She turned her face toward the window. She had believed, for a moment, that she had managed it entirely. She had not entirely managed it. The tears came quietly, without her full permission, and she let them come, because there was no one to see. Nathaniel was looking at her. She realized this when she turned back and found him watching her with the steady attention he brought to things that mattered. She had been wrong. He had seen. He said nothing. He reached across the carriage and took her hand, and she let him keep it for the rest of the drive home. 3 days later, Alcourt's team located a sympathetic county judge. Vivienne's estate assets were frozen by injunction the following morning. 4 weeks before the full hearing became 3. Nathaniel rode to Westhorn alone. He had not been to the estate before, not once in the 3 years since he had known where it was and what it meant. He rode through the gates on a gray morning and sat his horse at the top of the drive, and looked at the house for a long moment before he continued down to the door. The house was in the hands of a steward appointed by the county during the disputed title period, and the steward received him with the careful neutrality of a man who had been told to expect a visitor and had his own opinions about what the visit meant. The old housekeeper was 82 years of age and had been at Westhorn since before the present century. Her name was Mrs. Trent, and she received Nathaniel in her sitting room off the kitchen with the forthright directness of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. "I was there," she said, when Nathaniel explained what he needed. November of 1789. The old earl brought her quietly, and the ceremony was done in the chapel with only the chaplain and myself and the earl's man. I have told no one in 34 years, because no one in 34 years has asked me directly, and I will not volunteer what I was not asked for. But I will say it under oath and before any court that requires it, because I am 82 years old, and I would like the record to be correct before I am finished with it. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Your mother was a decent woman," Mrs. Trent said. "She deserved better than what she got. So did you." He did not stay long. He had what he came for. The news about the certificate reached them through Hartwell 3 days later. Hartwell arrived at Aldcroft in the late afternoon and asked to speak with them both. He sat across the library table with his hands folded on the surface and told them, with the careful precision of a man delivering something difficult, that the copy of the 1789 marriage certificate in Alcourt's possession had come from the late Baron Aldcroft's papers. After the Baron's death, his creditor had called in the estate debt, and in the settlement of accounts, the creditor had sold a portion of the Baron's private correspondence and document holdings to a buyer who had subsequently transferred them to Alcourt. Vivienne's father had known. He had held the certificate, had known what it meant, and had protected it for as long as he lived. He had not been able to protect it past his death. Hartwell left, and Vivienne sat alone with it through the evening. She sat with a particular quality of quiet that comes from understanding something that has been true for a long time without your knowing it. Her father had known about Nathaniel's name. Her father had carried this secret alongside her own. Not because she had told him, because she had not, because he had died before Catherine arrived, but because he had known the old Earl, had known the secret, and had kept it in his papers as a form of safekeeping. She had been walking in his footsteps all along without knowing the path had been laid for her. In the morning, she told Nathaniel. She sat across from him at the library table and told him what Hartwell had said. And she found, in the middle of it, that her hands were not entirely steady. She had not expected that. She had held herself steady through the petition and the assembly rooms and the injunction. And it was this, her father's quiet faithfulness to a secret he had carried alone, that undid the composure she had been maintaining. Nathaniel reached across the table. He took both her hands in his and held them until the trembling stopped, and she let him, because she had promised herself no more concealment, and because the truth was that she needed his hands on hers in that moment, more than she needed to appear composed. The full hearing was held in the magistrate's chambers on a Tuesday morning in late January. The room was larger than the anteroom of the preliminary hearing, with benches along the walls and a gallery above for observers. Alcourt was present with his full legal team and the county judge, whose presence in the gallery made Hartwell's expression briefly attentive, and 2 additional counsel. Vivian sat beside Nathaniel at the respondents' table with Hartwell between them and the leather folio on the surface before them. Alcourt's case was presented first. It was thorough and well constructed. The secret marriage of 1789, the annulment, the claim of fraudulent identity, the assertion of undue influence over a woman of compromised judgment. The certificate was produced again. The annulment notation was cited. The solicitor argued that a Groom's son, with no documented history in any county record, had exercised deliberate deception over a vulnerable woman, and had now claimed, without legitimate basis, a title and estate to which he had no legal right. Hartwell rose. He called for the reading of Mrs. Trent's witness statement, which the magistrate's clerk read into the record in full. Her name, her age, her position at Westhorn in 1789, and her first-hand account of the marriage ceremony conducted in the chapel that November. He then produced the letter from the Church of England archivist in Lincoln, confirming in writing that the annulment notation in the registry had been entered on the 14th of March, 1803, and that the death of the 4th Earl of Westhorn was recorded as the 2nd of March, 1803, making the annulment legally void. Alcourt's solicitor attempted a technicality. He argued that the date of the annulment filing was itself uncertain, that the registry entry might have been made on a different date than the one cited, and that without the original Lincoln Diocese registry entry, the confirmation letter was insufficient. Hartwell reached into the folio and produced the original Lincoln Diocese registry entry. He placed it before the magistrate. He waited while the magistrate examined it. The date was clear. The handwriting was period consistent. The entry was precisely what it claimed to be. The magistrate looked at Alcourt's solicitor with the expression of a man who had been presented with a great deal of paper and had now arrived at the paper that settled the question. He ruled. The annulment was legally void. Nathaniel Edmund Harcastle was the legitimate 5th Earl of Westhorn, son of Edmund Harcastle, 4th Earl, and Catherine Harcastle née Voss, his lawfully married wife. The marriage between Nathaniel Edmund Harcastle and Miss Vivian Aldcroft, contracted by special license, was valid and stood. The petition for annulment was dismissed in its entirety. The boundary agreement between the Alcourt estate and the neighboring Fenwick property, executed under the authority of a disputed title, was referred for formal legal review. The room was very quiet for a moment after the magistrate finished speaking. Nathaniel turned to Vivienne. He turned fully in his chair so that he was facing her, and the gallery and the chamber and Alcourt's entire legal team were behind him, and entirely beside the point. He looked at her the way he had looked at her on the morning of the license, in the stable yard before first light, when she had asked him to trust her for one morning, and he had said all right, with the full attention he gave to things that mattered. "You spent 3 years protecting my name," he said, "before I knew what it was." He did not say it for the room. He said it for her. "I would like the rest of my life to protect yours." Court stood and left the chamber without speaking. He did not look at either of them. He walked past the magistrate's table and through the door, and the sound of his footsteps on the stone floor outside diminished and stopped. In the gallery above, Lady Fenwick sat very still. That evening, the library at Aldcroft was warmer than it had been in weeks, because Vivian had told the housekeeper to build the fire high. And the housekeeper, who had her own opinions about the outcome of the day, had built it very high indeed. The marriage certificate lay on the table, and beside it was a frame that Vivian had retrieved from the storage room that afternoon, a plain oak frame that had once held a botanical illustration her grandmother had loved. "Here," she said, and handed it to Nathaniel. He looked at it. He looked at her. "The certificate," she said. "I want it on the wall. I want it where I can see it." He took the certificate and fitted it carefully into the frame while she held the backing in place, and then he carried it to the wall beside the fireplace and held it up. She stepped back and looked at it. "A little higher," she said. He moved it higher. "There," she said. He pressed it to the wall, and she brought the small hammer and the nail, and when it was hung, he stepped back and stood beside her, and they looked at it together. The 1789 certificate, the names, the date, the proof of everything that had been true all along and had simply needed someone to refuse to let it be buried. Nathaniel extinguished the lamp. The fire was still high and the room was warm, and the certificate was on the wall in the frame that had once held her grandmother's flowers, and the rest of it followed in the natural way of two people who had spent 3 years building toward the same point from opposite directions and had finally arrived. By morning, 2 cups of tea sat on the library table, their steam rising in the early light. Between them, open to the county survey of 1798, lay a map of the West Horn estate, its boundaries, its tenants, its disputed southern edge, the land that was now theirs to understand and manage and put right. Their next problem, the first one they had ever begun with everything on the table, and no concealment on either side, and the particular steady warmth of 2 people who have learned that the person beside them has been facing the same direction all along. Vivienne picked up her tea. Nathaniel reached across and turned the map slightly so they could both see the southern boundary clearly. Outside, the frost was already lifting from the stable cobblestones in the early light.